Sign the paper, Diane. We need the equity from this house for the startup, and you do not really need all this space anyway. My son-in-law, Marcus, pushed a $500,000 loan agreement across my dining table, while my daughter, Chloe, nodded in agreement. I am Diane, 62 years old, a retired corporate actuary who spent 30 years building a life they felt entitled to dismantle. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just picked up my pen and smiled. What they did not know was that the pen in my hand was about to sign their eviction notice and bankrupt that precious startup overnight. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect yourself from the people you raised. It was Sunday evening. The roast was still warm on the oak table I had polished that morning. Marcus tapped the loan document impatiently. He needed $500,000 to save his failing company. Chloe, my own daughter, looked at me with cold calculation and said, "Mom, you stay home all day anyway. Marcus is changing the world and you have to help us." I looked down at the deep scratch on the wood, the same scratch I made 20 years ago dragging heavy furniture into this house when my husband Richard nearly lost everything. Now Richard was sitting right there checking his expensive watch. "Sign it, Diane," Richard said without even looking at me. "I am planning to sell this house anyway. It is too big for you." The dining room flowed seamlessly into the kitchen. I had spent 4 hours that afternoon scrubbing the granite countertops until they gleamed and polishing the brass handles on the oak cabinets. I woke up at dawn to prepare the pot roast they were currently devouring. I even ironed the linen napkins they were carelessly tossing onto their plates. Meanwhile, Chloe and Marcus had arrived 2 hours late. They walked through the front door carrying nothing but complaints about the traffic. Chloe dropped her heavy winter coat over the back of a pristine dining chair and immediately asked if dinner was ready. She is 34 years old, but she still speaks to me like an impatient customer waiting for a slow waiter. Marcus did not even have the decency to compliment the meal. He spent the first 20 minutes of dinner scrolling through his phone and talking loudly about venture capital. Then he pushed the $500,000 loan agreement across my polished oak table. Chloe reached across the centerpiece, taking another slice of bread and casually ripping it apart. "Mom, you really need to look at the big picture," she said while chewing her food. "We are suffocating in our tiny luxury apartment. Marcus is so close to securing his next round of funding. The investors just need to see that he has skin in the game. You and Dad have all this tied-up equity just sitting here doing absolutely nothing. It is incredibly selfish to hoard it when we are trying to build our future." I looked at my daughter, the girl whose private college tuition I paid in full by working 50-hour weeks at the firm while she changed her major 4 different times, the girl whose lavish wedding cost more than my first home. She sat there in a silk blouse, swirling her expensive wine, acting as if my house was simply an uncashed check she had somehow misplaced. Sitting here doing nothing. That is exactly how she described the home I spent 3 decades paying for maintaining and protecting. Marcus leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms over his chest. He wore a black turtleneck, desperately trying to look like the tech billionaires he worshipped online. His startup was an app that tracked dog walking routes. It was burning through cash faster than a forest fire, but he called it disruptive. "Diane, it is just basic economics," he said in that condescending tone he reserved exclusively for women over 50. "Real estate is a dead asset. Tech is the future. I am actually giving you a chance to be part of something massive. You should be thanking me for the opportunity to invest at this early stage." Thanking him. I let his words hang in the heavy air of the dining room, the sheer audacity of a man who had not produced a single dollar of profit in 4 years, sitting at my table eating my food and telling me to thank him for the privilege of mortgaging my life. I looked past his smug face toward the hallway where our family portraits hung perfectly straight on the wall, photos of a happy family that only existed inside those wooden frames. I glanced at Richard sitting at the head of the table. He was cutting his meat with precise, indifferent strokes. He did not say a single word to defend me or the home we built together. He just took another sip of his scotch and waited for me to cave. He had spent our entire marriage expecting me to yield to keep the peace. They all thought my silence was a sign of weakness. They thought I was just an aging housewife too tired to fight back. "Let us talk about the big picture," I thought to myself. The big picture was Marcus spending $20,000 on a corporate retreat to Miami last month, while his developers complained about late paychecks. The big picture was Chloe calling me crying 3 weeks ago, asking me to pay her car lease because they were broke. Now they wanted $500,000. They did not want a loan. They wanted a royal tribute. They looked around my pristine home and saw nothing but a piggy bank waiting to be smashed open. I picked up the heavy silver pen Marcus had provided, not to sign his ridiculous paper, but to hold something solid to keep my hands from shaking. It was not fear making my fingers tremble. It was a cold, calculating fury. A lifetime of quiet sacrifices was rapidly condensing into a single heavy drop of absolute clarity. They completely forgot that I spent my entire career as a corporate actuary calculating risk and identifying terrible financial liabilities. And right now, I was looking at 3 of the worst liabilities I had ever encountered. I set the pen down gently next to the document. I looked directly into my daughter's eyes and smiled a cold, hollow smile. The loan document sat exactly in the center of the table, right over a deep gouge in the polished oak. I did not look at Marcus. I did not look at Chloe. I looked down at that jagged scar in the wood. 20 years ago, we were entirely drowning in debt. Richard had leveraged everything we owned on a commercial property deal that went bankrupt overnight. The bank was actively coming for this very house. I was the one who quietly liquidated my own childhood inheritance to save him. I was the one who rented a cheap moving truck in the dead of winter because we could not afford to hire professionals. I dragged this heavy oak dining table through the front door with my bare hands, while Richard sat on the porch smoking a cigarette and feeling sorry for himself. The metal leg of the table caught the doorframe and deeply gouged the wood. I spent hours sanding it down, but the scar remained. It was a permanent, quiet reminder of the massive weight I carried to keep this family from completely collapsing. Now my 34-year-old daughter sat across from me, eating the meal I cooked in the house I saved, telling me I was hoarding wealth. I reached for the bottle of Pinot Noir. The glass felt heavy and cold against my palm. I poured the dark red wine slowly, watching it swirl inside the crystal glass. The room was loud with Marcus endlessly talking about venture capital and user acquisition metrics. His arrogant voice echoed off the walls of a home he had never paid a single dollar to maintain. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. I let the silence stretch across the dining room. I did not speak up to defend myself. I did not remind them of the inheritance I drained or the countless nights I stayed up balancing our checkbook while they slept comfortably upstairs. Explaining my past sacrifice would mean asking for their sympathy, and I was completely done asking these people for anything. They eagerly took my silence for submission. They looked at my quiet demeanor and thought I was staring at the table because I felt entirely defeated. They had absolutely no idea that I was silently tracing the memory of my own unbreakable strength. I saved this family once when I had nothing. Now I had the upper hand, and I was preparing to protect my peace from the exact people who thought they owned me. The silence in the dining room was abruptly broken by the clinking of ice against crystal. Richard finally set his glass of scotch down on the table. He did not look at my face. He did not ask how I felt about risking the only home we owned. Instead, he calmly adjusted the cuffs of his expensive shirt and looked at his gold Rolex. "Just sign the paper, Diane," he said, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. "You are overthinking this as usual. I am planning to sell this house anyway. It is far too big for you to manage now, and the maintenance is a drain on my finances." My own husband sat there casually referring to our home of 30 years as a drain on his finances. He did not say our finances. He said his. The man I had saved from total ruin was now looking at me like an expired lease agreement. Chloe smiled, and Marcus pushed the heavy silver pen closer to my hand. They thought they had me completely surrounded. They thought this was the end of the discussion. But they did not know I had already spoken to my attorneys about this exact moment. At 7 o'clock on a Monday morning, I was jolted awake not by birdsong or the gentle chime of an alarm, but by a violent splintering crash from downstairs. The relentless pounding of a hammer against solid wood, the sharp shatter of breaking glass. My heart slammed against my ribs as I threw on my robe and ran down the staircase. I thought a burglar had broken in, or that some horrible accident had just torn through my home. But the scene waiting for me in the kitchen was worse than any nightmare I could have imagined. 4 strange men were swinging sledgehammers, smashing apart the oak kitchen cabinets I had personally chosen and carefully preserved for over 20 years. White dust hung thick in the air, choking the very room where I had cooked thousands of meals for my family. And in the middle of that devastation stood Marcus, my son-in-law, casually sipping an iced coffee. He held a tablet in one hand, calmly pointing and giving orders to the workers. Not far away, my daughter Chloe sat in an armchair in the living room, lazily scrolling on her phone beside a chaotic pile of suitcases. I rushed into the kitchen, my voice trembling with shock, and demanded to know what the hell they were doing in my house. Marcus turned toward me with an icy expression, not a trace of embarrassment or guilt on his face. "Good morning, Diane," he said in that flat, condescending tone people use with servants. "We've decided to move in here for a while. Our apartment is too cramped and it's not suitable for running a fast-growing tech company. Besides, the feng shui in this kitchen is a complete disaster. It's blocking the entire flow of wealth and energy in the house. I brought in a renovation crew to tear out this outdated oak and replace it with a black marble island. It'll help stimulate my creativity." I stood there frozen, unable to believe what I was hearing. Fighting to steady my shaking hands, I asked how they dared destroy my house without even asking for permission. Chloe finally looked up from her phone and let out a dramatic sigh. "Oh my God, Mom, you're being so overdramatic again. Dad already said yes last night. He told us you wouldn't have a problem with it because this kitchen is ancient and embarrassingly dated anyway. Your taste is stuck in the 80s, and Marcus is just helping increase the value of the family property. Honestly, you should be thanking him. Thank him." She was telling me to thank the man who was demolishing my home. I stared at the shattered oak scattered across the floor. Those weren't just cabinets. They were the surfaces I had wiped clean after every family holiday, every celebration, every ordinary dinner for 30 years. And now they were being reduced to rubble because of the so-called energy flow of an arrogant man who had never earned a single real profit in his life. I stepped toward the construction crew and ordered them to stop immediately. Then I turned and looked Marcus straight in the eye and asked where he got the money to pay for this absurd project. He smirked, took a step back, and answered in that smug, patronizing voice of his, "Don't worry, Diane. I used your joint credit card for the first deposit. Richard said the limit was still high, and he considers this a small investment in my work environment. Besides, you two are sitting on too much idle money while young innovators like me actually need capital to change the world." My blood boiled. He wasn't just invading my space, destroying my property, and treating me like I didn't exist in my own home. He was spending the money I had sacrificed and saved as if it belonged to him. They had turned me into a ghost inside the very house I had built my life in. I looked around for Richard, but of course he wasn't there. He had already left for work, leaving me alone to face the war zone he had approved. He had deliberately disappeared so the children could trample all over my dignity without resistance. They thought I would scream cry, and eventually clean up this mess the way I had cleaned up every other mess handed to me throughout my life as a wife and mother. Marcus looked at me with the pitying expression of a man who believed he was a genius. He tapped one finger against the last bit of countertop still standing and told me I should go upstairs and rest because older people often struggle with change. I didn't say another word. I didn't let them see a single tear. I simply turned around and walked slowly back up the stairs, leaving the sound of the hammers crashing behind me. They thought my silence meant submission. They thought I was surrendering. What they didn't know was that every blow landing downstairs had just shattered the last piece of mercy left inside me and awakened a legal monster they never should have provoked. I didn't go upstairs to cry. 30 years of being a wife and a mother had taught me one brutal truth. Tears are the most worthless currency in the world. That was what they were waiting for. They expected me to collapse, to hide under the covers, trembling while they took over my home piece by piece. But they had forgotten who I was before I became Chloe's mother and Richard's wife. I had once been a financial risk analyst. My job was to find the smallest fracture in a concrete wall and predict the exact moment it would collapse. They thought I was nothing more than an outdated housewife. They were catastrophically wrong. I walked past the living room while the sound of sledgehammers still thundered against the oak in my kitchen. I no longer cared. I pushed open the heavy door leading to the garage. The air in there was cold thick with the smell of motor oil and dust. In the far corner, hidden behind boxes of old holiday decorations, stood my metal work table. On top of it sat the laptop I still used to manage the family finances. I lowered myself into the cold plastic chair and turned it on. The bluish glow of the screen lit my face in the darkness. Down there, the garage was completely silent, cut off from the chaos upstairs. I opened a fresh spreadsheet. My hands did not shake. My heartbeat slowed steady and cold. The familiar comfort of numbers, of logic, of analysis began to flood my mind, pushing every ounce of pain and outrage out of the way. I logged into the central banking portal that held all of our shared assets. For more than 20 years, I had been the one calculating every tax payment, every savings deposit, every retirement fund contribution to make sure our future was secure. Richard had always left those things to me while he busied himself with flashy real estate projects. But the way he had stood back and allowed the children to tear my house apart, the way he had coldly pushed me to sign mortgage papers, had awakened a terrible instinct in me. I began scanning the transactions. At first, everything looked normal. The household checking account was stable. Marcus was draining the joint credit card, but those were relatively small numbers. Then I dug deeper into the long-term investment funds and my personal retirement accounts. This was where my life was stored. This was the money I had built by saying no to designer handbags and luxurious vacations. The screen took a few seconds to load, and when the numbers finally appeared, my eyes locked onto the total balance. There was a deficit, not a minor fluctuation caused by the stock market. This was a crater. I opened the transaction history for the previous 6 months. My analytical mind began dissecting the columns automatically. April 15th, $150,000 withdrawn. May 20th, another $200,000 gone. June 8th, $300,000 more transferred out. The transactions continued, scattered and intermittent, but executed with surgical precision, so they would never trigger the bank's fraud alerts. I scrolled to the bottom of the report. A total of $800,000 had vanished. $800,000. That wasn't money lost in a bad investment. That was money deliberately siphoned away. I didn't gasp. I didn't scream. I sat motionless in the dark and let the truth sink into my bones. My husband was quietly moving assets, preparing for an escape. By then, my anger had transformed into something far more dangerous, something cold, sharp, and lethal. I started tracing the money. I followed the receiving account number, and it led to a limited liability company that had been created just 8 months earlier. I accessed the Illinois Business Registry and searched for the owner's name. The result appeared on the screen. The CEO was not Richard. It was a name I didn't recognize at first, a 28-year-old woman named Sarah Jenkins. Then I remembered. She was the new assistant who had joined Richard's real estate office earlier that year. She was 6 years younger than my daughter. Suddenly, every piece of the puzzle slid into place with such perfect, disgusting clarity that it almost made me laugh. Richard's indifference, his willingness to let the children destroy my home, was never accidental. He was trying to strip me bare to force me into surrendering everything voluntarily. He wanted to throw me out with nothing so he could buy a luxury condo and build a shiny new life with a younger woman using my money to do it. Upstairs, the pounding started again. They were tearing apart my kitchen to prove they had power. But what they didn't know was that in that dark garage, I had just found the death sentence for their future. $800,000 in hidden asset transfers during a marriage was not something the law would politely ignore. I plugged a USB drive into my laptop. I saved everything: bank statements, transaction IDs, the registration documents for that shell company. I printed every page, hard evidence, steel evidence, evidence that could not be explained away. They wanted to play financial games with a former risk analyst. They had chosen the wrong woman. I closed the laptop, and darkness swallowed the garage again. But inside my mind, every step of my counterattack was already burning bright. I wasn't just going to take back what belonged to me. I was going to use the law itself to grind their arrogance into dust. I stared at the name Sarah Jenkins glowing on the computer screen. A 28-year-old woman with golden hair and an innocent smile, the same girl Richard had proudly introduced at last Christmas party as his brilliant young intern. $800,000 of my sweat, my sacrifice, my entire lifetime of discipline had been transferred neatly into a shell company under her name, and it did not stop there. I kept digging through the Cook County online property records. That LLC had just completed an all-cash purchase of a penthouse worth exactly $800,000 in the heart of downtown. My husband had not lost money in some failed investment. He was building a new love nest flooded with light and stuffed with luxury furniture for his young mistress using the retirement fund I had spent a lifetime protecting. I leaned back in the plastic chair in the garage. A chill crept down my spine, but my mind had never felt clearer. Then my phone vibrated. It was a sync notification from the shared family storage account I had set up years ago to manage schedules and household records. An email had just been sent to Chloe's inbox, and by pure accident, it flashed across my screen. The subject line was an invoice for luxury furniture from a high-end Italian design store. Every instinct I had as a former risk analyst pushed me to open it. The delivery address was not Chloe and Marcus's cramped apartment. It matched digit for digit the exact penthouse Sarah Jenkins's company had just purchased. I frowned and decided to go deeper into my daughter's account. What I found next killed the last fragile piece of motherhood still alive inside me. It was a message thread between Chloe and Richard from 3 months earlier. Chloe had caught her father having dinner with Sarah at an expensive restaurant. But instead of reacting with outrage or telling me the truth, my daughter had turned his betrayal into a brutal business deal. Her message was cold, calculated, and merciless. "Don't worry, Dad. I won't tell Mom. But Marcus needs funding, and we can't wait any longer. Convince her to sell the house and give me $500,000. I'll help clear the path so she signs the divorce papers willingly and never suspects a thing." Richard had replied immediately. "Agreed. Follow the plan and I'll handle the paperwork." I read those words again and again. Every sentence felt like a sharpened blade carving through my heart. My own daughter, the child I had carried, the child I had stayed awake for through fevers and nightmares, had been willing to sell me out for $500,000. She had not only known about her father's affair, she had chosen to become part of it. Suddenly I remembered the cold look in Chloe's eyes at dinner the night before, when she accused me of selfishly hoarding dead assets. She had not said that because she cared about Marcus's future. She had said it because she was carrying out her part of the deal with Richard. She wanted to bury me in guilt and pressure, in emotional exhaustion, until I gave up the house without a fight. She had even happily helped choose leather sofas and crystal chandeliers for her father's mistress, while using my own credit card to destroy the kitchen of the woman who gave her life. The shamelessness of it was beyond anything I thought human decency could survive. They had built a perfect plan to strip me of my assets, throw me out of my own home, and divide the spoils over the wreckage of my life. They thought I was a blind, aging fool. They thought their secret arrangement was airtight. But they forgot one very important thing. Every digital transaction leaves a trail. And following trails was exactly what I had spent years mastering. I saved the entire message thread and the furniture invoice into a secure folder. The evidence of collusion and hidden asset transfers was now complete. Upstairs, the hammering had finally stopped. In its place came laughter, Marcus and Chloe celebrating what they believed was their victory. But in the world of finance, when you uncover fraud, you never alert the criminals right away. You let them keep dancing. You let them believe they still control the board. And then you wait for the perfect moment to strike one clean, devastating blow that cuts off every source of life they have left. I took one long, steady breath and erased every trace of my search from the computer. At that moment, I was no longer a mother trying to hold her family together. I was a creditor preparing to collect every last cent with the harshest penalties the law could deliver. The next morning, the doorbell rang, announcing a package delivered from Richard's private law office. It was a thick stack of documents sealed inside a heavy envelope. I opened it right there at the kitchen table while the workers were still hammering away in the background. The cover letter was written in polished legal language, warm and deceptively gentle. Richard explained that because Marcus was now running his company out of our home and his finances were supposedly unstable, it was necessary to create a legal shield. He called it a post-nuptial property agreement, designed to protect me from any debt or financial fallout caused by my son-in-law. But the moment I turned to the third page, the instincts of a woman who had spent years working with thousands of insurance contracts recognized the stench of deceit immediately. This agreement was not written to protect me. It was a perfectly engineered trap designed to strip me of everything. The clauses were crafted with chilling precision. In the event of a divorce, I would voluntarily surrender all ownership rights to this house in exchange for a pitiful amount of support money. Worse still, buried in tiny print near the end, was a clause stating that I would permanently waive any claim to our shared retirement fund. That was how he planned to legitimize the $800,000 he had stolen to buy a home for his young mistress. He and my ungrateful daughter had calculated every move down to the last detail. They intended to weaponize my love for this family to use my own concern for my children as the weakness that would push me straight into the trap. They believed a woman over 60, a housewife, who had spent her life taking care of everyone else, would panic at the thought of her children's financial ruin and blindly sign whatever her husband placed in front of her. Maybe another woman would have signed through tears and despair, but they had forgotten exactly who they were dealing with. They were up against a woman who had spent 30 years measuring and pricing human deception one page at a time. I looked down at that agreement and let out a bitter laugh. They thought I was the prey. What they did not understand was that I was the one holding the knife. I did not tear the papers up. I did not call Richard to scream or demand answers. I calmly folded the documents and placed them beside the bank statements I had printed the night before. His trap would never close around me. Instead, it would become one of the finest pieces of evidence I could place before a judge to expose the full cruelty of his intentions. I grabbed my coat, picked up my handbag, and walked out the door. It was time to meet with my own trust attorneys and prepare for a complete legal purge. Let them enjoy their imaginary victory a little longer, because the countdown to their destruction had officially begun. By Friday night, my house was no longer mine. It had been turned into a cheap stage for Marcus's arrogance. He had invited nearly 50 people, angel investors, self-proclaimed tech experts, and startup executives, into my home for a funding event. The living room where I used to host quiet afternoon tea with friends was now drowning in the smell of expensive perfume hard liquor and the clinking of glasses. And I, the legal owner of this house, the woman who had paid for every brick and every inch of hardwood floor, had been reduced to an unpaid servant in my own kingdom. Marcus hadn't hired a professional catering staff. He had simply assumed that carrying trays, collecting empty glasses, and wiping stains off the floor were the natural duties of a retired mother-in-law. He stood in the center of the room, wearing a sharply tailored black suit, rambling on about strategic vision and billion-dollar cash flow. And I, in a pale gray blouse and an old apron, moved silently through the crowd with a tray of smoked salmon and champagne flutes. Every time I passed Marcus, he didn't even bother looking at me. He would just jerk his chin or flick his hand, signaling for me to clear the dirty glasses from the coffee table. My daughter Chloe stood beside him, smiling brightly, playing the role of the polished, successful wife. She watched me struggle past with a heavy tray and never once reached out to help. Worse, she even tugged at my sleeve to complain that the toast had gone cold, and coldly told me to hurry back to the kitchen and warm it up before the investors got annoyed. I nodded obediently. I cleared the dirty plates. I carefully wiped up the red wine some stranger had spilled across my hand-woven Persian rug. I kept my head lowered and wore the mask of quiet submission. When they looked at me, they saw nothing but a harmless older woman, a fading shadow, a free tool with no voice and no value. What they didn't know was that behind that silence, behind that obedient face, the mind of a former financial analyst was working like an execution machine. Every insult, every dismissive glance, every act of contempt was being cataloged, stored, and added to the sentence I was preparing for them. The peak of the humiliation came when Marcus climbed onto a small platform that had been set up in the middle of my living room to present his app. He projected imaginary growth charts onto my giant television, while the investors nodded as if they were impressed. Then one older man holding a wine glass asked Marcus about operating costs market risk and how he planned to manage his seed capital in such a difficult economy. Marcus gave a smug smile, slipped one hand into his pocket, and declared that he had an exceptionally strong family financial foundation backing him. Then he pointed directly at me. "You see," Marcus announced loudly, his condescending voice carrying across the entire room, "our society has two kinds of people. Those brave enough to build the future, and those too fearful to let go of the past." My mother-in-law, Diane, is a perfect example of the second kind. She's a woman with an outdated traditional mindset. She has spent her whole life fearing risk, counting every penny, and clinging to dead real estate assets while the world outside is changing at full speed. Fortunately, our generation knows how to restructure wasted resources like that. My father-in-law and I have decided to mortgage this very house and use the full income from the downtown office building to go all in on my company. We're turning lifeless bricks into a stream of technology. The room erupted in murmurs of approval and admiration. A few people shot me pitying, almost contemptuous looks as I stood against the wall in my apron. He was humiliating me publicly. He was turning my diligence, my caution, and 30 years of hard work into some pathetic symbol of weakness and irrelevance. He was claiming the assets I had sacrificed for as if they were trophies he and Richard had earned. He was selling my dignity for a few approving nods from strangers. My husband Richard stood at the bar sipping expensive whiskey and smiling with pride at his son-in-law's speech. He showed no shame at all while my life's work was turned into a spectacle. Of course not. He was too busy calculating how much he could still strip from me once he forced me to sign the divorce papers, so he could move into that penthouse with his young mistress. Together, they were a vicious alliance of parasites dressed up as powerful men. I stood there, both hands gripping the cold silver tray so tightly my fingers ached. If I had been an impulsive woman, I might have hurled that tray straight into Marcus's face, screamed the truth, exposed them all, and called the police to throw every last one of them out of my house. But my rage did not explode into noise. It sank inward, deeper, colder, and sharper than any blade. I looked at Marcus's smug grin, Chloe's fake applause, Richard's cruelty, and I let them have their little moment. Let them celebrate. Let them keep building their castles of illusion on land they believed was already theirs. Because I knew something they did not. When you let your enemies climb to the highest peak of arrogance, the push that sends them falling becomes far more devastating. I quietly lowered my head and walked back into the kitchen. I set the tray down on the marble counter. Inside my pocket was the phone containing every piece of evidence, Richard's hidden asset transfers, the furniture invoices for his mistress, and the confidential legal documents proving that Sterling Holding LLC was the true and sole owner of this house and the office building Marcus was already 3 months behind on rent for. They were drinking wine and dancing on top of a bomb I had planted myself. I turned on the faucet, poured myself a glass of cold water, and smiled alone beneath the yellow kitchen light. Let them call me outdated. Let them treat me like an invisible servant. Very soon, this invisible servant was going to clear their entire lives off the table, strip away everything they had, and leave behind not even the smallest crumb of mercy. On Saturday morning, sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, but all I felt was cold. I pulled an old fabric suitcase from the back of the closet, the kind we used on cheap vacations 20 years ago. I started stuffing it with a few worn-out clothes, the kind I usually wore for gardening or scrubbing floors. I deliberately left behind every expensive dress, every piece of jewelry Richard had given me on anniversaries. I was staging a performance and I needed to play the part of a woman who had completely fallen apart, a defeated wife, retreating from her own battlefield. I dragged the heavy suitcase down the stairs. Every step was slow-weighted, deliberate. In the living room, the wreckage from last night's so-called investor party was still scattered everywhere. Richard sat on the leather sofa, leisurely holding a cup of black coffee while reading the morning paper. Chloe and Marcus were at the dining table eagerly discussing how to expand the company once they mortgaged the house. The moment they heard the wheels of my suitcase scraping across the wooden floor, all three of them looked up at me. I stopped in the middle of the living room, my head lowered, refusing to meet their eyes. In a shaky, exhausted voice, I told them I needed some space. I said I was going to stay for a few days at a small motel on the outskirts of town so I could think about the agreement Richard had sent me. I even took a long, trembling breath, as if I were fighting back tears on the verge of breaking. Richard folded the newspaper. He did not look surprised. He did not look sorry. In fact, I caught the faintest smirk of satisfaction flicker across his face. "Fine, Diane," he said in a cold voice wrapped in fake kindness. "Go get some rest. Things have been a little tense for you here lately. Think very carefully about what I offered. It's the best solution for all of us right now." Chloe stepped forward, crossed her arms, and looked at me with that same mixture of pity and superiority. "Take care, Mom," she said flatly. "And please look after your health. We'll clean everything up here so you don't need to worry about a thing." Marcus didn't even bother lifting his eyes from the tablet in his hands. He just made a low, dismissive sound in his throat, as if my presence or my disappearance meant absolutely nothing inside that house. They had completely bought the performance. They believed the humiliation of the night before had shattered the last of my resistance. Deep down, they were already celebrating, convinced that when I came back, I would quietly sign away every asset I owned in exchange for a little counterfeit peace. I nodded, turned around, and walked out the front door. The moment the oak door shut behind me, I could hear their laughter begin to rise again in the living room. They thought I was driving to some sad little motel to cry myself empty. But the second I got into the car and started the engine, the defeated posture vanished. I sat up straight, adjusted the rearview mirror, and pulled a pair of black sunglasses from my handbag. I was not heading for the outskirts of town. I turned the wheel and drove straight toward downtown Chicago, where I had already booked a suite of luxury rooms at the Ritz-Carlton. My top trust attorneys were waiting for me there, along with the file that would decide the fate of every person now laughing at me. They thought I was running away. In reality, I was only stepping back far enough to gather force for a blow that would crush them all. In the presidential suite at the Ritz-Carlton on Michigan Avenue, the silence was absolute, except for the low hum of the air conditioner and the soft rustle of turning pages. I sat in a deep red velvet armchair, sipping black coffee with no sugar. There were no tears, no collapse, no trace of a pitiful housewife who had just been driven out of her own home. Instead, across the glass table from me sat two of Chicago's top attorneys in trusts and complex asset law. Harrison was a middle-aged man with graying hair and horn-rimmed glasses. Mitchell was younger, sharper, and carried the expression of a predator perfectly at home in the legal world. They were men who had worked with me quietly for years, carrying out my strictest financial instructions without anyone in my family ever knowing. Harrison pushed his glass of water aside and carefully opened a black leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick file, the pages yellowed with age. These were not newly prepared documents. This was the file I had taken from the basement myself, sealed and stamped 15 years ago. They thought I was just a foolish woman trapped in the past. What they never understood was that the past was their death sentence. 15 years earlier, when Richard had been drowning in a disastrous commercial lawsuit and standing on the edge of losing everything, I had stepped in and saved him. But I had not saved him for free. I took another sip of coffee and asked Harrison for the status update. My voice was cold-clipped and completely stripped of emotion. Harrison cleared his throat and began to read. Mrs. Sterling, we have reviewed the full structure of Sterling Holding LLC. Just as you arranged 15 years ago, all major assets, including the suburban mansion and the downtown office building, were legally transferred into an irrevocable trust. Mitchell continued, immediately flipping to the second page and pointing to a faded signature. This is the asset waiver Mr. Richard Sterling signed with his own hand. At the time, he did it to shield the property from creditors and prevent seizure. But under Illinois law, by signing this document, he voluntarily surrendered all personal ownership rights and all marital property claims over those real estate assets. Then he looked straight at me. There is only one beneficiary and one executive decision-maker with full authority over Sterling Holding. You, Mrs. Sterling. At this point, Richard is nothing more than a tenant in the house. I smiled, but it never reached my eyes. They were drunk on power tearing apart my kitchen and making plans to mortgage a house they had no legal right to touch. They thought that fake post-nuptial agreement could trap me. They had no idea I had been holding their financial lifelines in my hands for over a decade. Using the joint credit card to destroy my kitchen was not just disrespect. It was corporate property damage I could sue over with ease. I set down my coffee cup and slid the stack of bank statements I had printed the night before across the table. I want you to review this as well, I said in the voice of an executive assigning work. $800,000 has been withdrawn from the joint retirement fund over the last 6 months. It was funneled into a shell company under Richard's mistress's name and used to purchase a luxury penthouse downtown. I traced the transaction codes myself and collected the supporting evidence. Harrison frowned as he picked up the statements and reviewed them. His face hardened the moment he grasped how serious it was. Mitchell gave a cold, professional smile. He ran his fingers across the printed transaction codes as if he were holding a weapon. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, almost sounding pleased, "this is a clear breach of fiduciary duty within the marriage. Secretly moving marital funds to a third party in order to purchase real estate while still legally married to you constitutes dissipation of marital assets. We not only have grounds to freeze that penthouse immediately, but we can also ask the court to order full repayment plus penalties and legal fees. That young woman will be thrown out onto the street with nothing before she even understands what happened." I nodded, satisfied. But I had no intention of stopping there. The punishment needed to be total. I turned to Harrison and brought up the downtown office building, the one Marcus, my son-in-law, was using as the headquarters for his ridiculous tech company. He had just stood in front of dozens of investors and bragged that his family had him covered, that he never had to worry about office costs. He humiliated me to make himself look powerful. He treated me like a servant. Harrison opened another file and checked the numbers. "Your son-in-law's company is 3 months behind on rent. Under the commercial lease Sterling Holding signed with his business, we have full legal grounds to terminate the lease immediately." I told Harrison to draft the eviction order at once. I did not want a warning notice. I did not want them given time to negotiate, stall, or reorganize. I wanted the Cook County Sheriff to personally post the lockout notice on the company's front door. I wanted every server, every file, every illusion he was living on to be sealed inside that building until he paid every cent of rent due plus penalty interest. "Make sure it goes into effect the moment I give the signal." Mitchell kept writing rapidly in his notebook. Then he looked up and asked when I wanted all of it executed. I turned toward the hotel window and looked out over the glittering Chicago skyline sinking into the night. The traffic below was nothing but blurred streams of light. I pictured Richard sipping whiskey in my house while fantasizing about his young mistress. I pictured Chloe shopping for furniture with my money. I pictured Marcus getting high on false praise and borrowed power. They had cornered me, humiliated me in front of strangers, and tried to steal the last peaceful years of my life. They wanted to play a cruel game. I was about to show them what the real rules looked like. "Have everything ready within 4 days," I said slowly. "Next Friday is my 62nd birthday. Richard has secretly invited friends and business associates. He plans to use that party as a stage to force me to sign the divorce papers and announce the sale of the house in front of everyone, so I'll be too humiliated to resist. I will attend that party as the true owner of everything, and I want you to prepare a very special birthday gift for me. A complete legal package, final, irreversible, impossible to deny, so I can hand it to them myself in the middle of the celebration." Both lawyers nodded. They understood perfectly. They began packing up the files and promised to work through the night to make sure every legal mechanism was airtight, sealed like a fortress with no weakness left exposed. When they left the suite, I stood up and poured myself a glass of red wine. Darkness settled over the room, broken only by the pale moonlight filtering through the glass. I took a slow sip and felt the bitterness spread across my tongue. They thought I was a gentle, obedient mother, an aging woman easy to manipulate. They were catastrophically wrong. They had awakened a legal monster, and now that monster was ready to swallow their entire world whole without leaving behind a single scrap. 3 days later, I drove back to the mansion looking utterly broken. I stepped through the front door with slumped shoulders and downcast eyes, every inch of me resembling a woman who had just survived a devastating emotional collapse and finally given up. The house was still drowning in the children's chaos. Richard was sitting in the living room at the glass coffee table, and in front of him lay an elegant cream-colored invitation embossed with gold lettering. He gave me a warm, artificial smile, so sickly sweet it made my stomach turn, then slid the card toward me. In a voice dripping with false concern, he said that he and the children had done a great deal of thinking about all the recent tension. He said, our family needed healing, and there could be no better occasion than my 62nd birthday celebration this Friday night. He had personally invited 50 guests, close friends, business associates, and even longtime neighbors to raise a glass in my honor. Chloe emerged from the kitchen, holding a glass of fruit juice, and eagerly joined in, saying she had already ordered a 3-tier cake from the most expensive bakery in the city to make up for the family's recent mistakes. I picked up the invitation. My fingertips brushed across the exquisitely engraved lettering. My heartbeat never changed, but my mind was analyzing the situation at lightning speed. In 30 years of marriage, Richard had never once organized a proper birthday celebration for me with his own hands. Most years, he simply handed me a credit card and told me to go buy myself something nice. So why all of a sudden was he turning my birthday into a grand social event for half the upper class to witness? The answer was painfully obvious. This was not a birthday party. It was an execution stage carefully designed to corner me with nowhere left to run. He knew my nature better than anyone. For decades, I had been the woman who protected the family's image at any cost. I had always chosen silence and endurance to hide the cracks inside this house from the prying eyes of outsiders. Richard was betting on that very pride, that very instinct. He planned to turn those 50 distinguished guests into an unwilling jury. He was going to wait until the room was brightest, until the laughter was loudest, and then publicly announce the sale of the house and hand me the divorce papers along with that pathetic property agreement. He was convinced that, overwhelmed by shame and fear in front of a crowd, I would never dare to scream protest or fight back. He thought I would sign like a lamb led to slaughter, sacrificing everything just to preserve appearances. They truly believed they had woven a flawless web of psychological manipulation with no weak point anywhere. I looked Richard directly in the eyes, then turned toward Chloe's smug face. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I simply slipped the invitation into my handbag, nodded softly, and thanked them in the gentlest voice I could manage. I told them I was deeply touched by the family's thoughtfulness and that I would make sure to prepare properly for that evening. My submission made Richard visibly relax. He patted my shoulder with theatrical generosity, then turned and walked upstairs, absolutely certain he had already won this game. But what he did not know was that the moment I turned away, a cold smile spread across my lips. I walked into my bedroom and locked the door behind me. Then I opened my expensive handbag. Beside that ridiculous invitation sat a thick stack of legal documents stamped with the bold red seal of my trust attorneys. Inside were the original copy of the Irrevocable Trust Agreement, the court-signed eviction order for Marcus's company, and the asset freeze order for the penthouse owned by his young mistress. I crossed to the closet and ran my hand over the dull gray household clothes I usually wore. This time, I pulled open the bottom drawer and took out a black silk dress perfectly tailored by hand. I had bought it years ago, but had never found the right moment to wear it. This Friday, I would not wear it like an abandoned wife. I would wear it like armor, like a queen returning to reclaim her kingdom. Richard wanted a grand stage to humiliate me. They wanted to use the pressure of the crowd to force me into submission. Perfect. Because I needed those exact witnesses to watch the moment I buried their future, their careers, and their arrogance with my own hands. Let them count down to Friday. The weapon was loaded, and I was completely ready. At 8 o'clock on Friday night, my house had been transformed into a stage so lavish and artificial it was almost nauseating. They had hired a full professional staff, rolled out a red carpet from the front steps, and lit the entire garden with hundreds of crystal lamps. The 50 invited guests were all powerful names from Chicago's upper crust. Real estate investors, cunning attorneys, and bank executives Richard regularly entertained. They stepped into my home wearing designer suits and expensive evening gowns, trailing clouds of perfume so heavy they smothered the familiar scent of the roses I used to arrange by hand in the front hall. I stood tucked away in a shadowed corner near the bar. Instead of wearing the beautiful black silk dress I had prepared, I chose a dull faded gray dress that made me look drained, older, and completely swallowed by the glittering crowd. It was deliberate. I wanted Richard and the children to believe I had truly broken. I wanted the guests to look at me with that quiet pity reserved for an aging wife who had lost her place and was about to be pushed out of the game. Richard stood in the center of the living room like a king basking in his own glory. He wore an expensive dark blue suit, a glass of champagne in hand, smiling broadly and shaking hands with every guest who approached him. He played the role of the successful, generous, magnanimous husband to perfection. But the thing that disgusted me most, the thing that made the air in that party feel almost impossible to breathe, was the arrival of one very special guest. She walked through the front door in a clingy silk dress that showed off every curve of her 28-year-old body. Her golden hair had been curled into soft waves, and her lips were painted a bright, shameless red. It was Sarah Jenkins, the assistant intern, and the woman whose name sat on the deed to the $800,000 penthouse Richard had bought with my retirement money. Richard did not hesitate for even a second. He strode forward, took her coat, and loudly introduced her to the room as the company's new strategic business partner. The shamelessness of it all went far beyond anything a decent human being should be capable of. Sarah casually slipped her arm through Richard's and walked through my living room as if she belonged there. She ran her fingers over the oil paintings I had chosen myself and offered fake compliments about the home's refined taste. Worse still, Chloe and Marcus quickly gathered around her too. My own daughter cheerfully raised a glass to the woman destroying our family, laughing with her, as if they had been dear friends for years. They were openly standing on the same side, openly rejecting me, turning me into a ghost, an unwanted extra in the middle of my own birthday celebration. A few guests, who had known me for years, noticed me standing alone in the corner. They gave me polite nods, their eyes full of awkward pity, and practiced avoidance. Not one of them came over to truly ask how I was. Not one of them cared what it felt like for a woman on her 62nd birthday to watch her husband parade his mistress in front of her face. They were practical people. They understood the rules of money and power, so they stood with the stronger side. They stood with Richard because they believed he was the one holding the authority, the wealth, the future. In their minds, I was nothing more than a dependent wife with no real voice, a woman who would soon be shown the door and forgotten. The air in the living room was so thick with falsehood that every breath felt contaminated. They were trampling my dignity, eating from my crystal plates, and casually discussing how this fortune would be divided once I was gone. Rage surged inside me like molten lava, but I did not let even the slightest frown betray it. I tightened my grip around the glass of water in my hand and silently studied every face, every arrogant smile, every smug expression. Enjoy yourselves, I thought. Drink every drop of that expensive wine. Dream of the luxurious future you believe is waiting for you, because this stage may have been built by all of you, but the final script belongs entirely to me. And when the curtain falls, not one of you will still be smiling. The sharp clink of a silver spoon tapping against a crystal champagne glass sliced through the whispers in the living room. Richard stood near the grand fireplace, his face glowing with the warmth of expensive bourbon and unearned arrogance. He raised his glass, signaling for the 50 guests to fall silent. The soft jazz playing in the background was switched off by one of the servers. Every eye in the room turned toward my husband. Sarah Jenkins, his 28-year-old mistress disguised as a business partner, stood right beside him, her hand resting lightly on the sleeve of his custom-tailored jacket. Marcus and Chloe stood on the other side, radiant with anticipation. I remained in my dark corner, blended into the shadows of my own house, wearing the miserable gray dress they believed reflected my shattered spirit. Richard cleared his throat and smiled, that polished, well-rehearsed smile he used whenever he was closing multi-million-dollar real estate deals. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice smooth and echoing across the high ceiling of the living room. "For me and my family, having such dear friends and respected colleagues here to celebrate a very special milestone means more than words can say. Tonight we are honoring Diane." He gestured vaguely in my direction without even bothering to make eye contact. The guests politely turned toward me and offered light applause. I lowered my head slightly, playing the role of the meek, fated wife to perfection. Richard took a sip of champagne and continued. "For the past 32 years, Diane has been the quiet foundation of this family. She has managed this beautiful home, raised our wonderful daughter Chloe, and stood by my side through every rise and fall of my business career. But as we all know, time moves on, and seasons change. Diane has spent her whole life caring for others, and recently she and I have had many long, difficult conversations about her future and her health." He paused dramatically, letting the words hang in the air to make sure the entire room was hanging on every syllable. He was painting himself as the devoted husband making painful decisions for the good of his fragile wife. He looked around the room, his eyes shining with a hunter's excitement. Managing a $3 million suburban estate is simply no longer practical or healthy for her. The upkeep, the empty rooms, all of it has become too much of a burden. So after much consideration, we have decided that it is finally time for Diane to rest and enjoy the peaceful retirement she deserves. Next month, she will be relocating to a quiet, beautiful retirement community in Florida, where she can relax, garden, and live free of the heavy responsibilities that come with a property of this size. A wave of approving murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few people nodded sympathetically, whispering about how thoughtful Richard was to consider the strain I must have been under. Not one of them questioned why a husband would send his wife thousands of miles away to a retirement community while he remained comfortably in Chicago. They were completely seduced by the elegance of his performance. I stood motionless, my arms folded, listening as he publicly erased me from my own life. But Richard was not finished. He turned toward Marcus, who puffed out his chest and tried his hardest to look like a visionary leader. "As for this house," Richard declared, his voice rising with theatrical enthusiasm, "it will not be sold off to strangers. We believe in keeping wealth and opportunity within the family. My talented son-in-law, Marcus, is currently scaling a tech startup that is poised to disrupt an entire industry. However, a company at that level needs the right infrastructure and capital. Therefore, Diane and I have agreed to transfer the value of this estate directly into Marcus's company fund. This home will serve as collateral to secure his business future. We are turning these old walls into the foundation of a modern empire." Marcus stepped forward and lifted his glass to the room. "Thank you, Richard," he said in a voice dripping with fake humility. "And thank you, Diane. Your sacrifice is the seed capital of the future. We're going to make you proud." Chloe clapped loudly, tears of joy glistening in her eyes as she leaned against Marcus's shoulder. Sarah Jenkins beamed at Richard and whispered something into his ear that made him chuckle under his breath. They had done it. They had pulled off the perfect public ambush. Richard had framed my exile as an act of loving generosity, and Marcus had openly claimed my home as his personal bank account. The guests raised their glasses to celebrate the bright future of the family. The breathtaking audacity of that moment was almost suffocating. They were celebrating the theft of my life right in front of me. They expected me to step forward, shed a few grateful tears, and quietly accept my fate. They believed the social pressure of 50 wealthy, powerful people staring at me would force me to sign whatever papers they placed before me just to avoid causing a scandal. The applause faded, and the room fell silent again. Everyone looked at me, waiting for the desperate woman in the gray dress to say her little words and step aside. Richard looked at me with a cold, commanding stare. It was the kind of look that meant, "Do not embarrass me. Just nod and agree." I let the silence stretch. 1 second, 2 seconds. 2, 3. I could feel the crushing weight of their expectations pressing down on me. They thought I was drained. They thought I was nothing but a shadow. But I did not cry. I did not shrink. I slowly lifted my head, looked Richard straight in the eyes, and let a small, icy smile spread across my face. I was calculating the exact moment to step onto that stage and show them what real power looks like when a woman has been pushed too far. The crowd was still waiting for my reaction. They were expecting the defeated nod of a woman who had lost every ounce of power. And just as the silence began to turn heavy and suffocating, Chloe, my own daughter, stepped out of the crowd. She was wearing a shimmering emerald silk dress, and the smile on her lips was so radiant, so sweet, that anyone watching would have thought she was a loving daughter trying to comfort her mother in a deeply emotional moment. But when she came closer, that smile never reached her eyes. Her eyes were cold and sharp like shattered glass. She reached for my arm. Her perfectly manicured fingers dug into my flesh through the coarse fabric of my gray dress. It was not the touch of affection. It was a warning. In her other hand, she held a slim leather folder and a gold-plated fountain pen. She gently placed the folder into my hands. From the perspective of the guests surrounding us, it looked as though she were giving me a keepsake, perhaps a birthday gift or a guest book to sign. But I knew exactly what was inside. It was a death sentence for my 32-year marriage and an eviction order from my own home. Chloe leaned close to my ear. Her expensive perfume mixed with the scent of champagne as her breath brushed against my face. She kept smiling for the crowd, but her voice slipped through clenched teeth low enough for only me to hear. "Sign it, Mom," she whispered, every word crisp and venomous. "Don't make a scene here. Dad has already taken care of everything. If you behave and sign these papers, you'll get a small amount of money, just enough to rot away the rest of your life in some pathetic condo in Florida. But if you decide to play the victim, start crying or scream in front of all these people, Dad will call the lawyers and you won't get a single cent." I lowered my eyes to the documents in front of me. It was a divorce agreement and a property transfer form. Richard's signature was already there, bold, sharp, final. He and my son-in-law had planned this so carefully that they had even chosen Chloe to pressure me into signing. They were using the child I had carried in my body as the final psychological weapon. Chloe kept whispering, and now her voice was laced with pure contempt. "Look around you, Mom. No one here is on your side. They're all Dad's people, Marcus's partners. You're old. You're worthless now. You have no money, no power, no one left to protect you. So keep the last scrap of dignity you have and don't embarrass me by acting like some crazy old woman. Take the pen and sign before Dad loses his patience." Every word drilled into me like a steel bit through bone. My daughter, the child I had sat beside through fevers, the child I had rescued from credit card debt with my own savings, was threatening me in my own house. She called me worthless. She believed that because I had sacrificed my career to become the foundation of this family, I was nothing but a foolish, dependent woman. She was trying to force me to sell off the sweat of my life so she could keep shopping and wasting money beside her incompetent husband. I took the gold-plated fountain pen from her hand. The metal was cold against my palm. Around us, the crowd began to offer scattered applause, encouraging me to complete the ritual of my own surrender. Richard stood only a few steps away, wearing a triumphant smile. Sarah Jenkins rested her chin affectionately on his shoulder, waiting for the moment she would officially become the new queen of this fortune. Marcus stood with his arms folded, jerking his chin toward Chloe to hurry me along. Chloe tightened her grip on my arm even harder. Her nails were nearly cutting into my skin. "Hurry up, Mom," she hissed. "Your signature goes on the bottom right. Stop wasting everyone's time. You don't have any other choice. Just accept reality. You've already lost." I stared at the treacherous legal language spread across the page. They thought I was trembling from fear. They thought I was hesitating because I was heartbroken. But the truth was, I was savoring the depth of their stupidity. They had forgotten the most basic rule of any financial negotiation: never back your opponent into a corner until you know every card they're holding. I calmly pulled my arm free from Chloe's grip. The movement was slow but absolute. It was enough to throw her slightly off balance and force her to step back. The sugary smile on her face vanished instantly. She stared at me in confusion when she realized I was not crying. I was not collapsing. I did not bow my head in defeat the way she had expected. I straightened my back. That shapeless gray dress could no longer hide the authority of a woman who had personally controlled contracts worth tens of millions of dollars decades before Chloe ever understood what power meant. I held their gold fountain pen not to sign my surrender, but to draw a merciless line through every fantasy they had built. My gaze swept across the room. Those half-familiar, half-strange faces were sipping expensive wine, treating my humiliation like after-dinner entertainment. They whispered among themselves, wondering how soon the old wife would finally break. Their cruelty blended perfectly with the brutality of my own family, creating an invisible pressure so enormous that almost anyone in my position would have taken the deal just to escape the room in one piece. But I was not just anyone. I was Diane Sterling. I was the woman who had once saved this family from financial ruin and the only person in that entire house who still held the right to decide its fate. I looked back at Chloe. For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed her carefully painted face when she met my eyes. There was no maternal softness left in them now, no mercy, only the cold judgment of someone holding the power of life and death over an empire. She bit her lip and seemed ready to lean in again to spit out one more threat. But before she could, I lifted the papers high enough for everyone in the room to see. Every gaze snapped toward me. The silence became so complete that even the sound of breathing seemed loud. I uncapped the pen, and I prepared myself for the moment I would overturn the entire board they had spent months arranging. They had fired the first shot with all the elegance and spectacle money could buy. What they did not know was that the next bullet was aimed straight at their hearts. I tightened my grip around the gold-plated fountain pen. The space around me seemed to freeze solid. All 50 guests held their breath, waiting for the moment I would finally collapse. They wanted to see tears of despair fall onto the page. They wanted to watch an aging woman obediently accept the fate of being discarded. Chloe, my own daughter, was still standing close enough for her breath to brush against my ear, carrying the scent of expensive perfume and cold-blooded threat. She kept whispering for me to hurry up and end this pathetic little performance. My husband Richard stood there with a smug, triumphant smile, basking in the perfection of the trap he had staged so carefully. But they were wrong. I did not cry. I was not afraid. I lowered my eyes to the cheap divorce papers and the property transfer agreement. Then I placed the sharp nib of the pen against the white page. Instead of signing my name where they expected, I drove the pen down hard and slashed a brutal diagonal line across the document from one corner to the other. My hand came down with so much force that the nib tore straight through the thick paper and carved a deep scar into the leather folder beneath it. The dry, violent sound of ripping paper cracked through the silence like a gunshot, making everyone in the room flinch. Chloe stumbled backward. Her carefully painted face twisted in shock. Her mouth fell open, but no words came out. I turned to look at her, and there was nothing maternal left in my eyes. No softness, no patience, no surrender. What she saw was a woman who had been pushed to the final edge and had decided to smash every cage around her. I knocked her hand off me with one sharp motion. The force of it sent her reeling so badly she nearly lost her footing on the hardwood floor. She stared at me in panic as if some monster she had never truly known had just risen from the dead. I did not waste another second on her. I turned and straightened to my full height. The shapeless gray dress I was wearing no longer made me look pitiful. It became a cloak of authority, the uniform of a woman stepping out of the shadows to reclaim power. Then I began to walk. Every step I took against that wooden floor landed with steady, crushing weight. The guests who had been whispering about my weakness only moments before instinctively moved aside and cleared a path for me. They were overwhelmed by the cold force radiating from me. They did not yet understand what was happening, but every survival instinct in their bodies told them to get out of the way of the storm taking shape. Richard froze in the middle of the room. The victory on his face died instantly. He frowned confused, then tried to step forward and stop me. Through clenched teeth, he growled my name and ordered me not to make a scene. He tried to keep his voice low enough to preserve his dignity in front of the crowd, but I could already hear panic beginning to crawl through every syllable. I did not even look at him. I passed him as if he were nothing but a ghost. I walked straight to the small wooden platform where Richard had stood moments earlier, delivering his polished lies. I reached out and took the microphone. A sharp burst of feedback ripped through the sound system, making several guests wince and cover their ears. That shrill sound was like a blade slicing open the false velvet curtain of the evening. The room fell so silent you could hear the frantic rhythm of people breathing. Now every eye in the house was fixed on me, but the pity was gone, the contempt was gone. What remained was fear and a terrible, hungry curiosity. I stood on that platform and looked down at the people who had tried to take my life apart, piece by piece. I looked at Richard, whose face had already begun to turn pale. I looked at Marcus, wiping cold sweat from his forehead, unable to understand how the script had gone wrong. I looked at Sarah Jenkins, the young mistress, shrinking backward behind the crowd. And finally I looked at Chloe, my treacherous daughter, trembling as she clutched the edge of the dining table. I took one long breath, and when I spoke my voice did not shake. It was low, clear, resonant, full of the weight of a verdict that could not be appealed. I looked Richard directly in the eyes and began. I complimented his speech. I told him slowly, carefully, that he was very thoughtful, very generous, a man with a remarkable gift for arranging words in a way that made himself sound like a saint. But then I added that there was one very important legal detail he had deliberately left out of his perfect little performance. I slipped my hand into the expensive handbag I had brought with me. Then I pulled out the thick leather legal file stamped with the red seal of one of the top trust law firms in the city. I raised it high enough for everyone in the room to see. Under the glow of the crystal chandeliers, it looked like a sharpened blade poised to come down. Richard's confidence shattered instantly. His eyes widened the moment he recognized the law firm's crest on the cover. He had always known I used to be a risk analyst, but in that moment he finally began to understand something he should have feared years ago. I had never been asleep, and I did not need tears to rise again. All I needed was the cruelty of the law to teach them a lesson they would remember until their final breath. I stood on the wooden platform, my hand wrapped tightly around the microphone. Not a single sound moved through the vast living room. All 50 guests were holding their breath, their eyes locked on me. They were waiting for a collapse. They wanted tears. They wanted the pathetic breakdown of a woman who had just been thrown out of her own home by her husband. But instead of crying, I looked Richard Sterling straight in the eyes and began to speak. My voice did not tremble. It was low, clear, sharp, and so calm that the people standing closest to the platform visibly shivered. I told everyone in that room that my husband Richard Sterling had just delivered a deeply moving speech about sacrifice, generosity, and family devotion. He had announced that he wanted to hand over this $3 million house to my son-in-law's startup fund so that I could peacefully retire in Florida. It was on the surface a beautiful plan, a noble gesture, the kind of thing a strong family patriarch would do for the people he loved. But there was only one problem. Richard Sterling did not have the legal authority to sell, gift, or mortgage a single brick of this house. The room exploded into whispers. The silence shattered under the weight of disbelief. Richard frowned and took a step forward, clearly intending to snatch the microphone from my hand, but one look from me stopped him where he stood. My gaze pinned him in place. Then I opened the leather file I had brought with me from upstairs. From it, I pulled a stack of papers, yellowed by time, but still carrying the bright red seal of the Cook County Notary. I lifted the first page high beneath the crystal chandelier and began telling the guests a story Richard had spent 15 years trying to bury. 15 years ago, my husband's real estate firm had become entangled in a massive commercial lawsuit, one born from nothing but greed, recklessness, and his own arrogance. He stood on the edge of complete financial ruin. Creditors were preparing to seize everything, his bank accounts, his business holdings, even the very house we were standing in that night. And when that happened, Richard Sterling fell apart. He got down on his knees and begged me to use my own inheritance money from my side of the family to save him from drowning in the disaster he had created. And I did save him. I used my personal assets to pay his debts and seal the hole he had dug with his own hands. But I was never a fool. I had once been a senior financial risk analyst, and when I throw someone a lifeline, I make sure I am the one holding the rope. I tapped the paper in my hand and told the room exactly what it was, a notarized copy of a quitclaim deed. 15 years earlier, Richard Sterling had signed that document with his own hand, voluntarily and permanently surrendering every right, claim, and interest he had in this house, and all related commercial properties for one reason only: to keep creditors from freezing the assets. Richard's face drained of color so fast it was almost theatrical. His lips trembled, but nothing came out. Around him the whispers grew louder. A few guests even stepped back instinctively, distancing themselves from him like he carried some contagious shame. Finally, Richard tried to recover. He stammered that it had only been a temporary legal maneuver, a technical workaround, and that once the crisis had passed, the assets had naturally returned to the shared marital estate under the law. He was trying to sound confident again, but his voice had already started to crack apart. I smiled at him, but there was no warmth in it. They all thought I knew nothing beyond cooking meals and cleaning floors. They forgot that I had spent my youth studying invisible legal fortresses. I reached back into the file and pulled out the second document. It was printed on thick parchment loaded with the kind of legal language that does not bend, break, or forgive. Then I told Richard and every person in that room about Sterling Holding, slowly, clearly, deliberately. I explained that once Richard had surrendered his ownership rights, I had transferred every major asset directly into an irrevocable trust under the name Sterling Holding. Under Illinois law, once property is placed inside that kind of trust, it is separated entirely from marital property. It cannot be divided in a divorce. It cannot be seized for Richard's personal debts. And the founder's sole beneficiary and executive authority, with complete control over Sterling Holding, was not Richard Sterling. It was me, Diane Sterling. I read the legal clauses aloud while the room stared at me in shock. For 15 years, Richard had comforted himself with the fantasy that he owned this house. Yes, his name may have been on petty utility bills. Yes, he had strutted around this place like a king. But the soul of this $3 million estate, the legal ownership, the true power, the right to decide its future, had remained in my hands the entire time. He had never been the real estate millionaire he loved pretending to be in front of young women and business associates. In the eyes of the law for the last 15 years, he had been nothing more than a tenant living in my house, by my permission, rent-free. This house had never belonged to him, not for 1 second. Then I turned to Chloe and Marcus. My ungrateful daughter and her useless husband stood frozen in place. Marcus's mouth dropped open so hard that his champagne glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. Bubbles and wine spread across my Persian rug, but for once I did not care. I looked him directly in the face and told him that his grand plan to mortgage this house and use it to rescue his trash heap of a tech company was the most ridiculous fantasy I had ever heard. He could not mortgage an asset that did not belong to his father-in-law. And the forged authorization forms and coerced divorce documents they had tried to force me to sign that night were utterly worthless against the iron protections of the trust. Silence swallowed the room again. The only sound left was Richard's panicked breathing. He clutched at his head and staggered backward, accidentally crashing into Sarah Jenkins. His 28-year-old mistress recoiled in horror. The look in her eyes changed instantly from admiration and blind worship to disgust and fear. She had never known this secret. In that moment, she realized the powerful man she had attached herself to was nothing but a hollow shell, a man with no real wealth, no real ownership, no real power to protect her. I stood on that platform and looked down at every person who had mocked me, humiliated me, and tried to strip me of my life. They had made one fatal mistake. They had confused a mother's endurance with a loser's weakness. They thought they could use public pressure to force me into signing divorce papers and walking out with nothing. But now, with the law in one hand and indisputable evidence in the other, I had shattered Richard's fake crown in front of all of them. I had stripped him of every ounce of power and turned him in the middle of the birthday party he had designed to humiliate me from a domineering husband into a man standing one step away from homelessness. And when I looked at the desperation on his face, I knew the first blow had landed exactly where it needed to. It had crushed the pride of a traitor. Richard's collapse was only the opening act of the night. While the shocked whispers in the living room were still rippling through the crowd, I slowly turned my gaze toward Marcus. My arrogant son-in-law stood frozen in place, the smug, inflated expression of a man who had spent years calling himself a tech genius had drained from his face, leaving behind nothing but sickly panic. He looked from Richard to me, trying to process the truth that the gold mine he had planned to exploit had never actually existed. But he still did not understand the full scale of the disaster racing toward his own career. I stepped closer to the edge of the wooden platform and looked directly down at him. In a calm voice, I asked whether he remembered that wonderful little speech he had given just a few days earlier in this very room. I repeated his own words back to him one by one, the same words he had used to humiliate me in front of his investors. "Marcus," I said, "you called me a fearful woman clinging to the past. You bragged that I was hoarding dead assets while you were the one building the future. You proudly told everyone that your brilliant startup was backed by a powerful family financial foundation and that your glamorous downtown office was proof of your limitless potential." Marcus swallowed hard. He darted his eyes around the room, searching desperately for support from the angel investors standing among the guests. But now they were no longer smiling for him. They stood with folded arms, staring at him with suspicion and cold judgment. He forced a crooked, miserable smile and muttered that it had all been business talk, just harmless exaggeration, never meant to offend me. His voice shook as he begged me not to create a scandal in front of important guests and to preserve the family's dignity. I did not return that pathetic smile. Instead, I reached into my handbag and pulled out a second legal file. Beneath the blaze of the crystal chandeliers, I lifted a thick commercial lease agreement, high enough for the entire room to see. Then I told all 50 people in that house the truth behind Marcus's polished little illusion. I explained that his multi-million-dollar tech company was in fact leasing the entire 15th floor of a premium office building in downtown Chicago, a flashy address carefully chosen to deceive investors into thinking he was drowning in success and cash flow. Then I turned to the last page of the lease and held the signature section forward for everyone to see. And then I delivered the part Marcus had never bothered to tell his investors. The legal owner of that office building, the landlord named on the contract, was not some faceless corporate giant. It was Sterling Holding, and as I had already made very clear, the sole executive authority of Sterling Holding was me. Diane Sterling. The same outdated, foolish mother-in-law he had mocked with such confidence. It felt as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Marcus stumbled back a step, his mouth moving without sound. Chloe grabbed his arm, her face flooding with pure confusion and terror. His investors began whispering again, but this time the whispers were no longer polite curiosity. They had turned into anger, into suspicion, into the dawning realization that they had handed their trust and possibly their money to a fraud. But I was not finished. The real killing blow was still in my hand. I pulled one more sheet from the file, a pale yellow notice, thin and almost unimpressive at first glance. Then I read it aloud for everyone to hear. It was a formal notice of payment default and delinquency. My great and visionary son-in-law had failed to pay a single dollar of office rent for 3 consecutive months. He had burned through investor money on luxury trips, empty networking parties, and flashy technology meant to impress people, not build anything real. His company had no positive cash flow. It was an empty drum making a lot of noise, a polished fraud wrapped in expensive jargon. And now he had planned to use my house to cover the rot. That was the moment Marcus truly panicked. He lifted both hands toward me, begging me to stop. His voice cracked as he shouted that I could not do this, that I was destroying everything he had built over a matter of personal pride. He promised that the moment this new funding round closed, he would repay every cent double if necessary. He pleaded for one more chance. One more chance. I let out a cold, razor-thin laugh. You destroyed your own chances the moment you smashed my kitchen and tried to force me out of my home. Then I glanced at my watch. It is now 8:15 p.m., I said, looking straight into Marcus's terrified eyes. My voice was flat, quiet, and lethal. And I am not standing here to collect rent. I am standing here to inform you of a fact. 15 minutes ago, a commercial eviction order signed by a Cook County judge officially went into effect. I raised the eviction order, its red stamp blazing under the lights. At this very moment, while you are all here drinking champagne and celebrating your lies, the Cook County Sheriff and the enforcement team are already on the 15th floor of that building. They are changing every lock ceiling, every server, every personal computer, and every company file. As of this second, your startup is frozen. You no longer have access to a single thing inside that office until every dollar of delinquent rent and every penalty is paid in full. The moment I finished speaking, a shrill ringtone ripped through the room. Marcus's phone. His trembling hand fumbled into his pocket and pulled it out. The screen showed the building manager's name. He answered with fingers shaking so badly he nearly dropped the device. From the other end, the panicked voice of the manager spilled loudly enough for the nearest guests to hear the sheriff was posting notices across the office glass, and all staff were being ordered to evacuate immediately. The phone slipped from Marcus's hand and hit the hardwood floor with a dead, hollow crack. Then he collapsed. One knee slammed into my Persian rug as both hands flew to his head, tearing through the carefully gelled hair he had spent so much time perfecting. The entire imaginary empire he had built out of arrogance, performance, and deception imploded in less than 3 minutes. Chloe stood frozen, one hand covering her mouth, then broke into ragged sobs as the truth finally landed. Her husband was not a visionary. He was a bankrupt fraud, drowning in debt. His investors turned away at once and headed for the door without even offering a farewell. They knew they had narrowly escaped a spectacular con, and the con man they had admired minutes earlier was now nothing but a pathetic ruin on the floor. The room dissolved into chaos. But I remained standing on that platform perfectly still, like a stone monument watching the destruction I had personally unleashed. They had wanted to play a ruthless game, and I had just delivered checkmate, flipping the entire board, leaving not a single piece standing. The attention of the entire room shifted away from my failed son-in-law and landed on the young woman trying to shrink into the shadows at the edge of the crowd. Sarah Jenkins, the 28-year-old assistant who had been proudly clinging to my husband's arm just moments earlier, was now trembling desperately, trying to disappear into the sea of guests. But I was not about to let her escape. I turned my cold, razor-sharp gaze directly on her and called her name out loud. Then I demanded that she step forward so everyone in the room could get a proper look at Richard Sterling's so-called strategic business partner. She froze instantly, her face turning as white as a corpse. Richard reached toward her in a clumsy attempt to shield her, stammering that I should not drag innocent people into a private family matter. Innocent? I let out a laugh so sharp and loud it echoed through the stunned silence of the room. Then I slipped my hand into my expensive handbag and pulled out the final file. Unlike the old trust documents, these pages were crisp, bright white, freshly printed from my attorney's office just days earlier. I raised the bank statements and financial reports high in the air for everyone to see. Then I turned back to the crowd, those wide-eyed guests still standing there in shock, and continued the story. I told them that over the last 6 months, exactly $800,000 had quietly vanished from our shared retirement fund. The money I had spent a lifetime saving had been secretly funneled by Richard into a newly created shell company. And the sole executive officer of that phantom company was none other than the beautiful young assistant now cowering across the room. That same $800,000 had just been used to purchase a luxury downtown penthouse, a secret love nest for the two of them, paid for with the sweat of my entire life. A wave of furious whispers erupted across the room. A few of our old friends looked at Richard with naked disgust. My daughter Chloe covered her face and burst into sobs when she realized the money she had been scheming to grab from the sale of my house had already been spent by her own father on his mistress. I looked straight at Sarah as she started babbling that she knew nothing, that she had only done what Richard told her to do. But that performance of fake innocence meant nothing to a woman who had spent decades analyzing financial deception for a living. I tapped the file lightly against the wooden podium and spoke each word with brutal clarity. In Illinois, there is a very strict law against the dissipation of marital assets. Any husband or wife who secretly withdraws money from a shared account to spend on a lover to buy private property or to hide assets in any form during a marriage is breaking the law. Richard has committed a serious violation of that law, and the worst part for him and for his mistress is that my attorneys have documented every transaction with evidence that cannot be denied. Then I pulled out the court order. I announced that at 1 o'clock that very afternoon, a judge had officially signed an order freezing every bank account connected to that shell company and permanently locking down ownership of the penthouse. Sarah Jenkins, I said, my voice ringing through the room. You will never step foot in that apartment again. You are nothing but the name on stolen property, and the law will force you to repay every single dollar. And if that money is not returned, you will be facing criminal exposure for aiding in fraud and the unlawful transfer of marital assets. Sarah collapsed to her knees on the floor, both hands covering her face as violent sobs tore through her body. In that moment, she realized she had lost everything, her youth, her dignity, and now her future was being swallowed by legal consequences she had never imagined. Richard stood frozen where he was completely silent, completely broken. He had already lost his company, his assets, and this house. And now he was going to face court for stealing his own wife's retirement money. I stood there in absolute stillness. 3 legal blows had fallen, and with them I had shattered their arrogance, their lies, and their bottomless greed. They wanted to drag me down into the mud. But in the end, they were the ones sinking into the swamp they had built with their own hands. The heavy silence in the living room shattered like a sheet of thin glass. The 50 guests who only minutes earlier had been applauding and raising their expensive champagne glasses to celebrate my exile were now scrambling to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Richard. The glamorous illusion of the evening vanished in an instant. People began setting their crystal glasses down on whatever surface they could find, avoiding my husband's eyes, as if his sudden financial collapse were some kind of contagious disease. A well-known real estate developer, the very man who had been laughing and chatting with Richard all evening, abruptly turned his back and headed straight for the door. Others quickly followed, muttering rushed excuses about children at home or early morning meetings. No one wanted to be associated with a man who had just been exposed in the middle of his own living room as a fraud and a thief. Chicago's upper class is vicious. They never forgive failure. And tonight Richard had become the most humiliating failure any of them had ever witnessed. Richard stood frozen in the middle of the stream of people rushing to leave. He reached out, trying to grab the arm of an old golf partner, desperate to salvage the last scraps of his dignity, but the man recoiled in disgust and hurried out the front door. The grand farewell party Richard had carefully staged to humiliate me had turned into a public execution of his own making. The room emptied with astonishing speed, leaving behind a mess of half-eaten food and abandoned wine glasses. The string quartet had stopped playing long ago. They quietly packed up their instruments in embarrassed silence and slipped out through the back door. Sarah Jenkins, the 28-year-old mistress who had thought she had secured both a luxury penthouse and a wealthy older lover, was now gasping in panic beside the fireplace. She looked at Richard not with love or admiration, but with horror and absolute disgust. She grabbed her designer handbag and nearly ran for the exit, shoving past the departing guests without so much as a backward glance at the man she had conspired with. She knew the game was over, and she abandoned him to face the wreckage alone. Marcus was still on his knees on the Persian rug, staring in disbelief at the phone he had dropped. His tech empire had evaporated into thin air, and the investors he had proudly brought to the party had disappeared long ago, slipping out through the side door the moment the eviction order was announced. Chloe sobbed uncontrollably, black mascara streaking down her cheeks, finally realizing that the entire safety net she had trusted had been completely destroyed by the very men she had chosen to stand beside. She looked at her father and her husband and no longer saw protectors. She saw the architects of her total destruction, and I remained standing on the wooden platform, watching the chaos unfold with absolute calm. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I simply observed the violent shift of power in that room. The smug smiles, the patronizing whispers, the swollen arrogance that had suffocated me for months were all gone. In their place stood one undeniable truth: I was the one holding every card. The house was mine, the assets were mine, the future was mine. Richard looked around the nearly empty room, his face drained white, his breathing shallow and broken. Then he looked at me with eyes begging for mercy he had never earned. But he found none. The atmosphere of disaster hung over the villains like a suffocating blanket, thick and final. They had built a house of cards on the quiet sacrifices I had made for years, and all it had taken was one breath from me to blow the entire thing away. Marcus was still kneeling on the floor. His trembling hand picked up the phone again. He tried to call the building manager back, but all he got was the hopeless drone of unanswered rings. Every one of his employees had already been thrown out. The authorities had sealed every computer, every file, and locked every door. The startup he had bragged about so proudly, the great technological empire he had used to humiliate me, was now nothing but a pile of legal wreckage under government lock and key. He clutched his head and collapsed over the Persian rug, sobbing like a child whose favorite toy had been ripped away. Gone was the arrogance of a chief executive. Gone were the pompous speeches about building the future. What remained was nothing more than an incompetent man staring down a mountain of debt he would never be able to repay. And at that exact moment, Chloe, my daughter, stripped off the final mask of the sweet wife and loving child. The instant she realized her husband was bankrupt and her father was nothing but a penniless fraud, her selfish survival instinct took over. She spun toward Marcus, glaring at him with pure hatred. Then she began screaming at him with the most vicious words I had ever heard leave her mouth. She called him useless, a pathetic parasite, a shabby fraud who had lied to her about the luxurious life she thought she was marrying into. She screamed that she had tolerated his delusions for far too long and that she would never allow herself to be dragged into poverty because of the stupidity of a man too incompetent to understand his own limits. The cruelty in her voice was so sharp that even the remaining servers in the room visibly flinched. Then she turned on Richard. She pointed straight at the father she had just helped betray me for, and she hissed at him with naked fury. She accused him of being a disgusting liar. "You promised me $500,000, she screamed, her voice cracking with panic. "You promised that if I helped you get rid of Mom, you would give me my share so I could save this miserable family. And now what? You spent the money on your mistress and threw me into this disaster?" Richard did not even answer her. He stood in total silence. He understood the law too well for that. He knew that the irrevocable trust was a fortress he could never break into, and he knew just as clearly that the unlawful transfer of marital assets had been exposed with ironclad evidence. If he tried to fight, if he tried to deny it, he would only drag himself closer to prison. Any excuse now would do nothing but deepen the sentence waiting for him. So he stood there with slumped shoulders and hollow eyes staring into empty space, finally accepting the full scale of his failure and humiliation. And when Chloe realized there was no one left to save her, she turned toward me. She ran forward and dropped to her knees at the foot of the wooden platform where I was standing. Her hands clutched desperately at the hem of my gray dress. Tears poured down her face, smearing her expensive makeup into black streaks. "Mom," she sobbed. Her voice completely transformed now, suddenly soft and pitiful, like a frightened child begging for protection. "Mom, I'm sorry. They manipulated me. Dad and Marcus pressured me into doing terrible things. I always loved you. Please forgive me. We're family. Please don't leave me alone in this." I slowly lowered my eyes and looked at the daughter I had once carried inside my own body. There had been a time when my heart turned soft for her without resistance. A time when I had sacrificed every dream of youth for her comfort, her future, her happiness. But in that moment I felt nothing. Nothing except coldness. Nothing except emptiness. People like them only remember the word family when every privilege, every convenience, every benefit has been stripped away. I gently but firmly peeled each of her fingers from the fabric of my dress. Then I looked straight into her tear-filled, panicked eyes and spoke in a voice so flat it carried not even the smallest trace of pity. "My family died the night you stayed awake, sending messages bargaining me away to your father's mistress. The game is over, Chloe. That door is closed, and you are no longer my priority. Go change your own world." Then I turned my back on her and slowly stepped down from the platform, leaving her collapsed on the floor behind me, crying into the ruins of the life she had helped destroy. I stood in the middle of the living room with my arms folded, staring at the wreckage of a party that had just been crushed beyond repair. The last guests had fled long ago, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt almost dead. Richard sat dazed in the leather armchair, both hands hanging limp at his sides. Marcus was still bent over the hardwood floor while Chloe sobbed uncontrollably in the corner. They looked like lost ghosts inside the very house that just an hour earlier they had so arrogantly claimed as their own. I glanced down at my watch. Exactly 8:30 p.m. Then came a dry, deliberate knock from the front entrance. I did not need to answer it. I had already given them the spare key that afternoon. The heavy oak door swung open and 3 tall men in black suits stepped inside. They were the private security team I had hired from one of Chicago's top security firms. They moved with steady, disciplined strides, their faces cold and unreadable. The moment they entered, the last fragile illusion still clinging to the people in that room shattered. Richard jerked his head up. His eyes darted from the men in black suits to me, now wide with panic and raw terror. "Diane, what the hell are you doing?" he stammered. "Are you seriously throwing us out onto the street tonight? We were married for 32 years. You can't be this heartless." I walked toward him and stopped exactly 2 steps away. Then I looked down at him with the eyes of an owner clearing trash from her property. My voice was flat cold and utterly stripped of mercy. "Those 32 years ended the moment you decided to use my life savings to buy an apartment for your mistress. This house belongs to my trust company, and as the sole legal authority over that property, I am now ordering all unauthorized occupants to leave my house immediately." Then I turned to the head of the security team, a broad-shouldered man with a faint scar across his chin, and gave him a quiet nod. After that, I faced Richard, Chloe, and Marcus, and delivered the verdict clearly enough for every word to land like iron. You have exactly 30 minutes to pack only your most basic personal belongings, clothes, and toiletries. You are not permitted to take any jewelry, artwork, furniture, or anything purchased with money from our shared accounts. My security team will watch your every move, and if any one of you tries to steal even the smallest item, I will call the police immediately and add theft to the list of charges waiting for you. Your 30 minutes begin now. Not one of them dared argue. The authority in my voice had already crushed whatever resistance they had left. Chloe let out a broken sob, staggered to her feet, and ran up the stairs. Marcus pushed himself off the floor, picked up his phone with the shattered screen, and quietly followed after her. He did not even dare meet my eyes. Richard tried to salvage the last scraps of his dignity. He straightened his suit jacket, cleared his throat, and walked slowly toward the staircase, but his shoulders were slumped like a man who had just heard his death sentence. I stayed downstairs in the entry hall, listening to the pounding footsteps overhead, the violent slamming of closet doors, and the hopeless crying drifting down from the second floor. The security team stood like statues in the hallway, their sharp eyes missing nothing. Minute by minute, the clock moved forward. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of clear, cold water, took a slow sip, and felt a deep calm begin to fill my chest. No more insults, no more contemptuous stares, no more living like prey inside my own home. Exactly 29 minutes later, they came downstairs. Richard dragged an old leather suitcase behind him. Chloe carried 2 overstuffed bags of clothing. Marcus had nothing but a wrinkled backpack slung over one shoulder. They looked pitiful, broken, pathetic. The glittering arrogance they had worn just hours ago had vanished completely. I stood at the front door with my arms crossed and watched them step one by one onto the porch. The cold wind of a Chicago autumn night hit their faces hard. At the bottom step, Richard stopped. He turned back and looked at me one last time. There was pleading in his eyes now, a desperate, humiliated plea for mercy. "Diane," he whispered. I said nothing. I owed him no explanation. I owed him no kindness. I lifted my hand and wrapped it around the solid brass doorknob. My gaze was as cold as a blade, sealing every door to the past. Then I slammed the heavy oak door shut with one hard, final sound. The electronic lock beeped twice, confirming the house was secure. I stood there in the great front hall and took one long, deep breath. The house was completely silent. The war was over, and I had taken back my kingdom in full. 6 months had passed since the night I slammed the mansion door shut and left a treacherous family behind me. This morning, I did not wake to the sound of hammers destroying my kitchen cabinets, or to the shouting of children demanding more money. I woke to warm morning sunlight spilling through the rustic wooden window frame of a small villa perched on a hillside in Tuscany, Italy. I slipped into a soft silk robe, stepped out onto the balcony, and filled my lungs with the scent of ripe vineyards mingling with the morning mist. In my hand was a steaming cup of rich espresso. The world around me was utterly still, utterly peaceful. For the first time in 32 years, I was truly living for myself. No more chaotic investor parties, no more credit card statements drained by parasites, no more contemptuous words from the very people I had spent my life protecting. I had sold the suburban Chicago mansion at an excellent price, dissolved the trust, and used the money to buy myself a new life. A radiant second chapter that no one would ever be allowed to touch again. From time to time, through my attorneys, I still heard updates about the people who once tried to steal my life from me. They were paying a very expensive price for their arrogance and bottomless greed. Richard, the husband who had loved calling himself a powerful real estate millionaire, was now drowning in debt hearings and court proceedings. After his assets were frozen and his glamorous facade collapsed, he was forced to file for bankruptcy at 65. Now he rents a tiny room in one of the worst outskirts of Chicago. His 28-year-old mistress packed her bags and disappeared the very night everything fell apart, the moment she realized he was nothing but a broke fraud. Marcus, the son-in-law, who used to puff out his chest and call himself a tech genius, had vanished completely from the startup world. His company had been liquidated to satisfy creditors, and now he was working part-time in an electronics store just to make payments on the massive personal loans hanging over his head. And Chloe, my own daughter, the one who laughed at me and tried to push me out onto the street, was finally learning what desperation really feels like. She and her husband were barely surviving in a cramped, miserable apartment, drowning in bills and humiliation. She kept sending me emails filled with tears and pleas for help, begging me to send money so she could cover the rent for another month. But I instructed my lawyers to block every line of communication, and I never once bothered to read a single word she wrote. I took another sip of coffee and let that bittersweet taste bloom across my tongue. Then I smiled as I looked out over the endless green hills glowing under the brilliant Tuscan sun. I felt no guilt, no regret. The peace I owned today had been purchased with the strength and finality of the woman I chose to become yesterday. My life was only beginning now. For 32 years, I believed that being a good mother and a good wife meant giving away every piece of myself until there was nothing left. I thought my value was measured by how much I could endure, by how many fires I could put out for the people I loved. I spent my youth building a fortress for my family, and I willingly stood outside in the cold so they could be warm inside. But what I learned on that Friday night is that when you constantly set yourself on fire to keep ungrateful people warm, they will not thank you for the heat. They will simply complain about the smoke and ask why you did not burn brighter. Your money, your sweat, your sacrifices, they are not obligations. They are your armor. They are the tangible proof of your survival and your hard work. Do not ever let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting what you have built. Society tells women, especially older women, that we are supposed to be endlessly accommodating, that our resources belong to our children and our husbands. They expect us to step aside and fade quietly into the background. But I am here to tell you that your life does not end at 50 or 60. Your life truly begins the moment you stop paying for the privilege of being disrespected. I look back at the woman I was a year ago, the woman who stood silently while her kitchen was destroyed, the woman who almost signed away her dignity to keep a fake peace. I do not recognize her anymore. I am Diane Sterling. I kept my home, I kept my wealth, and most importantly, I kept my self-respect. You cannot buy loyalty, but you can certainly afford to evict those who betray you. That is my story, and if you have made it this far, I want to thank you for listening. If you are watching this and you have ever been the person who sacrificed everything only to be treated like an option or a bank account, I want you to know that you are not alone. You have the right to protect your peace. You have the right to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. I would love to hear from you. Tell me your story in the comments below. What was your breaking point? What was the moment you finally decided to stand up for yourself and close the door on toxicity? I read every single comment because your stories give me strength too. If this video meant something to you or made you feel a little less alone, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out, and it helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them the most. Check the description for another story that I think you will deeply connect with. Remember, your peace is priceless. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one.